My younger son, a ship captain, gave me a call. "Mom, something very strange is happening. Is my sister-in-law at home?" "Yes, she is," I answered. "She's putting our little Noah to bed." His voice dropped to a whisper. "That's impossible. I have her right here in my sights. She just sat down at a poker table on my cruise ship to the Bahamas." At that exact moment, I heard the floorboards creak upstairs. If you're watching this video, please give it a like, subscribe to the channel, and let me in the comments where you're watching this story of betrayal from. I'd love to know just how far it's traveled. That morning, like every other morning, I was busy clearing away the breakfast plates. My older son, David, had already left for his accounting firm, leaving the house in a state of calm. His son, my grandson Noah, that precious little 6-year-old bundle of energy, had already been scooped up by the school bus. And Chloe, my daughter-in-law, David's wife, had just headed upstairs. Her sweet voice drifted down to me. "Mom, I'm just going to put Noah down for his nap." "Of course, dear." I smiled to myself. I had just finished wiping down the counter when the kitchen phone rang. I dried my hands on my apron and went to pick it up. The bright, familiar voice of my younger son, Liam, came through the line. "Mom, just wanted to check in. I've got a bit of downtime while we're docked." Hearing from him was like a ray of sunshine. Liam is my adventurer, a young captain of a freight ship who spends his life on the open ocean, living the dream he's had since he was a boy playing with paper boats in the bathtub. I smiled and asked him about his latest voyage, how the crew was. He chuckled and said everything was running like clockwork. But then, his tone shifted, a note of confusion creeping in. "Hey, Mom, the weirdest thing just happened. Is Chloe at the house?" I was taken aback. I glanced up the stairs from where I could hear the faint sound of her humming a lullaby to Noah. "Of course she is, dear." "Chloe is upstairs with Noah right now," I said, with complete confidence. Chloe had spoken to me not 5 minutes before, wearing that lovely yellow sundress she favors on warm days. How could there be any mistake? But on the other end, Liam was quiet for a long moment. So long I could hear the faint hum of the ship's engines in the background. Then his voice returned, low and serious, laced with disbelief. "Mom, that's impossible because I'm looking right at her." She just walked into the ship's lounge and sat down at a high-stakes poker table. I let out a little laugh, sure he was teasing me. "Oh, Liam, you must have seen someone who looks like her." "I just spoke with Chloe. She even told me she was feeling a bit tired today." I tried to explain, to bring him back to reality, but he wasn't laughing. He didn't respond with his usual lighthearted banter. He told me, his voice slow and deliberate as if he was trying to make sense of it himself, that he was doing a walkthrough of the passenger areas. His company sometimes leased space to cruise lines, and he saw a woman who was the spitting image of Chloe. At first, he thought it was just a coincidence, but then she turned and he saw her face clearly. It was her. Same smile, same way she pushes her hair behind her ear. He said she was with a man, someone who looked slick and a bit dangerous. My heart started to beat a little faster, but I tried to keep my voice even. "Are you absolutely sure, Liam?" "It could just be a strong resemblance," I insisted, though a small seed of doubt had been planted. Liam sighed, and his voice was now a mixture of frustration and certainty. "Mom, I walked right past her table. She's sitting there with a huge pile of chips, laughing with this man. They looked very familiar with each other, their hands brushing." Liam's words felt like a punch to the gut. I stood there, frozen, the phone pressed hard against my ear. My mind was racing, laughing with a man. Impossible. I had just heard Chloe's gentle humming from Noah's room. I had seen her with my own 2 eyes, but in that very instant, the humming from upstairs stopped. I heard the bedroom door creak open, and Chloe's voice floated down the stairs, soft but clear enough to make my heart leap into my throat. "Mom, is someone on the phone?" A wave of panic washed over me. My heart was pounding so violently I was sure it could be heard across the room. "Just an old friend from the garden club," I called back, my voice shaking slightly. I quickly moved into the pantry, out of sight from the staircase where Chloe's head appeared, her hair slightly mussed. I shut the pantry door and whispered into the phone, my voice tight with anxiety. "Liam, I just heard Chloe. She's here. She just put Noah down." Are you positive you weren't mistaken? On the other end, Liam went silent again. Then his voice came back, sharp and insistent. Mom, it's impossible. She's right here on this ship. I'm looking at her right now. I was utterly speechless, my thoughts a jumbled mess. I hung up the phone, my hands trembling so badly I fumbled with the receiver. The pantry suddenly felt small and airless, despite the cool morning. I leaned against a shelf of preserves, trying to catch my breath, but my chest was tight with a question I couldn't answer. If Chloe was here, then who was the woman on Liam's ship? And if the woman on the ship was Chloe, who was the person in my house? A few minutes later, Chloe came down into the kitchen. She was wearing a simple blue house dress now, her hair tied back, and she offered me that same sweet smile. Mom, I'm going to run to the farmer's market. Do we need any fresh corn or tomatoes? Her voice was calm and familiar, as if nothing in the world was wrong. I looked at her, forcing my own smile, but it felt stiff and unnatural. Yes, dear. Some tomatoes would be lovely, I managed to say, my throat tight. Chloe grabbed her woven market basket and headed out the door, her figure disappearing down the driveway. I stood by the window, watching her go, a storm raging inside me. I couldn't believe Liam would lie to me. My son had no reason to invent such a wild story. He had always been the most dependable and honest of my boys. But Chloe, the daughter-in-law I had known and loved for years, was also standing right here, solid and real. Could there be something I was missing? Was there some hidden current running beneath the placid surface of this home that I, in my old age, had failed to see? I sat in the living room for a long time, the morning sun casting long shadows across the hardwood floors. The comfortable armchair where I always sat to read stories to Noah suddenly felt strange and unwelcoming. Liam's phone call played over and over in my mind, each word a question mark branded onto my piece. I looked at the family photos on the mantelpiece. David and Chloe on their wedding day, a tiny newborn Noah swaddled in a blue blanket, and Liam in his crisp captain's uniform, beaming with pride. All those happy moments now seemed shrouded in a fog of uncertainty. My name is Margaret Gable, a 68-year-old widow living in a pleasant, tree-lined neighborhood in Charleston, South Carolina. My husband, Arthur, passed away 5 years ago, leaving me with our 2 sons, the center of my world. David, the elder, is a meticulous accountant, a man of numbers and quiet stability. Liam, the younger, is my free spirit, the one who answered the call of the sea. My life is woven into the fabric of David's little family, his wife, Chloe, and my grandson, Noah, and the gentle rhythm of our days in this house. Chloe, my daughter-in-law, had always struck me as the perfect match for David. She was bright, organized, and always put together, from her tasteful clothes to the way she ran the household. I remember their wedding day, a lovely affair at a historic inn downtown. Chloe's family was modest, but they had poured their hearts into making the day beautiful. She came into our family with a warm smile and an easy grace, seemingly born for the role of a devoted wife and mother. I often thought how fortunate David was to have found her. After Chloe left for the market, I remained in my chair, my fingers twisting a loose thread on the upholstery. Liam's call forced me to look back at small things, little details I'd brushed aside. There were times Chloe would say she was going to her book club or meeting a friend for coffee, but she'd return looking different, tense, and a little on edge. One afternoon, she'd be full of light, teaching Noah a new song and baking cookies with him. The next, she'd be short-tempered, snapping at me for leaving a magazine on the coffee table. I had always chalked it up to the pressures of being a young mother. But now, I felt a knot of unease tighten in my stomach. I recalled an incident a few months back. Chloe was helping Noah with a drawing, her right hand guiding his smaller one to form the shape of a boat. Her movements were fluid and natural, but just a few days later, I saw her jotting down a grocery list with her left hand, her writing awkward and cramped, as if the pen were a foreign object. I'd asked her, "When did you become a lefty, dear?" She'd given a little laugh and said, "Oh, just trying something new, Mom." For a challenge. I had accepted it without a second thought, but now, that memory felt like a splinter in my mind. I was lost in these unsettling thoughts when the front door burst open. Noah came running in, his school backpack thumping against him. He threw his arms around my waist. Grandma, my teacher said my painting was the best in the whole class. I stroked his soft hair, trying to muster a genuine smile, but the weight in my chest was still there. Noah sat on the floor and opened his art folder. Grandma, look. Yesterday, Mommy helped me draw the sun with her right hand, and it was so round and perfect. But this morning, she tried with her left hand, and it looked all wobbly. The boy pointed to 2 different drawings, one with a neat, cheerful sun, and another where the sun was misshapen and jagged. My heart gave a painful lurch. Your mommy was probably just in a hurry this morning. That's why it looks different, I said, trying to smooth over the inconsistency. But Noah looked up at me, his eyes wide and honest. Grandma, Mommy is funny sometimes. Some days she gives me the biggest hugs ever, but other days she doesn't even want me to sit on her lap. My grandson's words were another piece of the puzzle that didn't fit. I pulled him close, trying to soothe him, but my own mind was a tangled mess. Just then, the doorbell chimed. I opened it to find Mrs. Gable, my next-door neighbor, holding the casserole dish Chloe had brought her last week. She had her usual warm smile, but her eyes held a spark of curiosity. Margaret, your Chloe is such a dear, but you know, yesterday when she brought this over, I noticed she handed it to me with her left hand. I thought you told me she was right-handed. How peculiar. Or perhaps she's ambidextrous. I forced a smile and replied, Maybe so, Eleanor. Would you like to come in for a cup of iced tea? She accepted, but her casual comment felt like another confirmation. It wasn't just me. Other people were noticing these oddities too. I served the tea, and we chatted about our gardens and the weather. But as soon as she left, I sank onto the sofa, my hand over my heart. I felt a chill despite the afternoon heat, as if a window had been left open somewhere. That evening, I was in the garden, watering my prize-winning roses, the gentle spray of the hose doing little to calm my thoughts. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, but I found no peace in the beauty of it. The words from Noah, from Eleanor, and Liam's unwavering voice on the phone swirled in my head, disturbing the calm I had cherished for so long. I was going through the motions of gardening, but my mind was miles away. Am I getting so old that I can't see what's right in front of me? Or have I been deliberately ignoring it, wanting so desperately to believe in the happy family I thought we were? Chloe returned from the market, her basket full. But the first thing I noticed was that she was carrying it with her left hand. I knew for a fact that Chloe always used her right hand for everything, from chopping onions to brushing Noah's hair. I watched her set the basket on the kitchen counter and asked, my voice carefully neutral, Did you find everything you needed, Chloe? Inside, a tide of suspicion was rising. She smiled and replied cheerfully, I did. I got some beautiful tomatoes and some fresh shrimp. Mom, I'm going to make that shrimp scampi you love for dinner tonight. How does that sound? Her voice was as sweet as honey, but my eyes were fixed on her hands. The left one? No, the right one. I nodded and turned away, pretending to wipe down a clean spot on the counter, but my heart was hammering against my ribs. Was I losing my mind, or were these tiny, jarring details trying to tell me a story? At dinner, the family gathered around the table. David looked tired after a long day at the office, but he still smiled and asked Noah all about his day at school. Chloe served the food with her usual grace, and even reminded David, Honey, don't forget the parent-teacher conference is next Friday. You'll need to leave work a little early. I watched her, trying to see the woman I thought I knew, but in the back of my mind, Liam's voice was a constant whisper. She's sitting at a poker table next to a man. I bit my lip, trying to push the thought away, but it felt like swallowing glass. Just 3 days later, the atmosphere was completely different. Noah accidentally knocked over his glass of milk at dinner, the white liquid spreading across the tablecloth. I quickly grabbed a cloth, chuckling, It's all right, sweetheart. Accidents happen. But Chloe, who was sitting across from him, slammed her fork down, her voice sharp. Noah, why can't you be more careful? Look at this mess. I stared at her, stunned. David frowned and said quietly, Chloe, it was just an accident. He's a child. She turned on him, her eyes flashing with an unfamiliar anger. You always take his side. I'm the one who has to clean everything up and be the bad guy. The mood at the table grew thick and heavy. Noah ducked his head, his lower lip trembling. I reached out and pulled him into a hug, a deep ache in my chest. Just a few days ago, she had been the picture of patience, and now she was a stranger. I sat there, observing in silence, trying to connect the dots. Today she was angry. The other day she was loving. Today she used her left hand. The other day, her right. These contradictions were piling up, forming a picture I couldn't yet fully see. I told myself to stay calm, but every time I looked at Chloe, I felt a disquieting sense of unease, as if I was looking at a photograph that was slightly out of focus. A few days after that, I was walking Noah to the park. He held my hand tightly as we walked along the familiar cobblestone path. Suddenly, he stopped and looked up at me, his little face clouded with sadness. "Grandma, yesterday Mommy helped me build a whole castle out of my blocks, and she was so much fun. But today she wouldn't even play with me. She said she was too busy." I knelt down to meet his gaze, and it felt like my heart was cracking. "Your mommy has a lot on her mind, sweetheart." "Don't be sad," I said, but my own voice was unsteady. Noah nodded, but his eyes were still filled with hurt. I hugged him, feeling a profound sense of helplessness. He was only 6. How could he possibly understand something that I, his grandmother, couldn't make sense of? That night, as we were clearing the dinner table, Chloe pulled a small ledger from her purse and began writing in it with her left hand. David, who was scraping plates, let out a laugh. "Honey, since when are you a southpaw? You look so awkward." Chloe froze for a split second, a strained smile on her face. "Oh, just trying to train the other side of my brain." She quickly slipped the ledger back into her purse, but not before I saw a flicker of panic in her eyes. David just shrugged and went back to the dishes, but I knew he'd noticed something was off too. I stood there clutching a dish towel, trying to maintain a neutral expression, but inside, the fire of suspicion was burning hotter. One morning, I took a jar of my homemade peach preserves and walked down the street to Eleanor's house. Chloe had borrowed a cup of sugar a week ago, and I was returning the favor. I knocked on her door, and Eleanor greeted me with her usual warmth. "Margaret, come in." "I was just about to put on a pot of coffee," she said, a dusting of flour on her apron. I handed her the preserves, intending to just have a quick chat, but she insisted I stay, guiding me to a chair in her sunny kitchen. The room was cozy and smelled of cinnamon, but I couldn't settle. Eleanor looked at me, her expression turning serious. "Margaret, I hope you don't mind me saying this, but has something changed with Chloe?" One day, she stops to chat over the fence and asks all about my grandchildren. But just yesterday, I saw her walking down the street. I waved, and she looked right through me, like I was a complete stranger. Eleanor's words were yet another ripple in the disturbed waters of my mind. I forced a smile. She must have had a lot on her mind, Eleanor. You know how it is. But my insides were churning. I knew Eleanor wasn't one for idle gossip. She was a keen observer of people. If she had noticed Chloe's erratic behavior, then my fears weren't just the ramblings of an old woman. I stayed a little longer, sipping the coffee that had gone lukewarm, and then made my excuses, my heart heavy. On the way home, I stopped at Mr. Henderson's bakery to pick up a treat for Noah. Mr. Henderson was wiping down the counter, and he smiled when he saw me. "Mrs. Gable, what can I get for the little guy today?" I ordered a cookie, and he leaned in conspiratorially. "You're David's mother, right? His wife came in last week. What a lovely woman. She told me my sourdough was the best in all of Charleston, but this morning, she came in with a face like a storm cloud, grabbed a loaf of bread without so much as a thank you, and stormed out." I stood frozen, my hand clutching my wallet. "She must have been having a bad day, Bill," I murmured, my voice barely a whisper. I paid for the cookie and left quickly. Mr. Henderson's words were another confirmation, another small cut in the fabric of my certainty. When I returned home, I made myself a cup of tea and sat on the back porch. The breeze was gentle, carrying the sweet scent of jasmine from the garden. I watched the path from the street where Chloe would soon appear. A few minutes later, I saw her returning, her market bag swinging at her side. She greeted me with a curt, "Afternoon, Mom." There was no smile, no cheerful report of the bargains she'd found, like the day before. I nodded and replied softly, "You're back." But inside, I couldn't help but study her. The blouse she was wearing was a crisp green, completely different from the yellow sundress she'd left in. I tried to ask casually, "Did you change your shirt, dear?" Chloe paused for a beat, then replied smoothly, "Oh, I spilled some coffee on the other one and had to change." She offered a tight little smile and disappeared into the house. I sat there, my teacup clutched in my hands, feeling as if the weight of the world was pressing down on me. The words of Eleanor, of Mr. Henderson, and Chloe's clipped response. It was all too much to ignore. That night at dinner, Noah was chattering away about a book he'd read at school, but I noticed Chloe barely responded, just giving distracted nods. When David said, "Finish up your dinner so your mom can clear the table," Noah turned to me, his voice piping and clear. "Grandma, my mommy didn't read me a bedtime story last night, but the night before she read my favorite one, about the brave little tugboat." I looked at Chloe, who continued to eat her food, her face a blank mask. But Noah's words struck a chord deep inside me. That tugboat story, the one my Arthur used to read to David and Liam, was a family treasure. Only Chloe and I knew how much it meant to our boys. So why would she read it one night and refuse the next? Why was she so inconsistent? I stood up to clear the plates, but my mind was a whirl. I remembered all the times Chloe had left the house, saying she was going to the library, only to return with a strange tension about her. Once she came home with an expensive-looking scarf she claimed she'd found on sale. But another time, she became defensive when I asked, "Did you have a nice afternoon, dear?" I had dismissed these as trivial things, but now they felt like clues to a much larger mystery. I didn't want to believe that Chloe was hiding something from us, but her every action, her every word, sowed more doubt. That night, after everyone was asleep, I sat at the kitchen table and pulled out an old gardening journal. My hand trembled as I wrote down the first entry. 3 p.m. Chloe leaves for the market in a yellow dress, returns 5:30 p.m. in a green blouse. Mood is tense. I didn't know what I was doing, but I knew I couldn't go on pretending everything was fine. I kept writing. Yesterday she read Noah the tugboat story, affectionate. Today she was distant, refused to read. Each word I wrote felt heavy, as if I were etching my anxieties into stone. My journal was quickly filling with notes about Chloe. Each entry was a fragment of my confusion, a piece of a puzzle I was terrified to solve. I sat in the kitchen, staring at the journal, my heart aching. I couldn't carry this burden alone anymore. The thoughts were a relentless tide, pulling me under. I needed to talk to someone who would listen without judgment, who wouldn't think I was losing my mind. My thoughts immediately went to Eleanor, my neighbor and dear friend for over 30 years. We had raised our children on this street, shared countless cups of coffee, and supported each other through life's storms. I picked up the phone, my voice unsteady. "Eleanor, do you have a minute? Could we meet at the cafe down by the waterfront? I really need to talk." Eleanor agreed at once, her voice full of concern. "Margaret, I knew something was bothering you. I'll meet you there in 20 minutes. I felt a sliver of relief, but the weight of my secret was still immense. I put on a cardigan and walked to the little cafe, a place where Eleanor and I had celebrated birthdays and mourned losses. The cafe was familiar, with its weathered wooden floors and the salty smell of the sea drifting in through the open door. I chose a quiet table in the back, where the light was soft. I sat there, wrapping my hands around a warm mug of tea, but a chill had settled deep in my bones. How could I even begin to explain my suspicions? How could I admit that I was doubting the woman my son loved? Eleanor arrived, her market bag full of fresh produce. She sat down and looked at me with her kind, perceptive eyes. "Margaret, you look like you have the weight of the world on your shoulders. Tell me what's happening." I took a shaky breath, the words catching in my throat. I told her everything, my voice barely a whisper. Liam's call from the ship, Chloe's presence at the poker table, and all the little inconsistencies I had been documenting. The changing hands, the wild mood swings. I pulled the journal from my purse and pushed it across the table. "Look, I've been writing it all down. I feel like I'm going crazy, but I can't ignore it any longer." Eleanor read through the pages, her brow furrowed in concentration. She read my cramped, worried script in silence. "You've noticed all of this, Margaret. she said, her voice serious. Every time she leaves and comes back, she's like a different person. What do you think is going on? I shook my head, clutching my tea mug. I don't know, Eleanor. I'm just so scared. Scared that Chloe is hiding something terrible. Scared that my family will be torn apart if I keep digging. But I can't stop now. I have to know the truth. For David, and for little Noah. Eleanor placed her hand over mine, her gaze steady. You have to trust your instincts, Margaret. There's clearly something very wrong here. If you don't find out what it is, you'll live in this state of constant anxiety, and you won't be able to protect your family. Just then, Mrs. Patterson, the woman who runs the local bookstore, came into the cafe. She spotted me and came over to our table. Margaret, what a nice surprise. You know, your daughter-in-law was in my shop last week. So charming. She bought a whole stack of art books. But this morning, she came in again and seemed so agitated. She barely said a word, just browsed for a minute and left. Is everything all right with her? I forced a smile and said, She's just been a bit stressed lately, Susan. But inside, I felt like I was sinking. Another person had noticed Chloe's strange behavior. I thanked Mrs. Patterson and watched her leave, then turned back to Eleanor, my panic mirrored in her eyes. Eleanor squeezed my hand, her voice gentle but firm. You see, Margaret? It's not just you. The whole town is noticing. You have to stop second-guessing yourself. Keep writing everything down, and if you have to, you need to follow her. Not to cause trouble, but to protect the people you love. I nodded, but my heart was heavy. I knew Eleanor was right, but the thought of spying on my own daughter-in-law made me feel like a traitor. I had dedicated my life to building a loving home, and now I was being forced to investigate one of its members. That afternoon, I returned home, my mind in turmoil. Chloe came downstairs carrying her usual red market bag. Mom, I'm just popping out to the store, she said, her voice light and airy. I nodded, but as soon as the front door closed, I opened my journal and wrote, 2 p.m. Chloe leaves for the store with a red bag. Mood seems normal. I sat by the window, watching the clock, each tick echoing my anxiety. At 4:30, Chloe returned, but the bag in her hand was now a plain brown paper one. I was startled and asked, Did you get a new bag? She smiled, a little too quickly. Yes, the other one ripped, so I had to get this one. I nodded, but my hands were shaking as I added to my journal, returns 4:30 p.m., with a brown paper bag, voice seems strained. My notes were becoming a chronicle of my fear. Each line was a step closer to a truth I wasn't sure I wanted to find, and a step further away from the trusting grandmother I used to be. On Saturday, David had to go into the office for a few hours, and Noah was at a friend's birthday party, leaving the house unusually quiet. I was dusting the living room, trying to keep my hands busy and my mind quiet. But then Chloe came down the stairs, wearing a pretty blue dress, looking as carefree as she did when she and David were first dating. Mom, I'm just going to run a few errands, she said sweetly. She picked up her basket and left. I smiled and nodded, but inside a voice screamed, Follow her, Margaret. Go and find out the truth. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my old shawl, pulling it over my head to partially cover my face, and slipped out of the house, keeping a careful distance behind Chloe. The afternoon sun was warm, but I felt a chill run down my spine. I just wanted to know where she was really going. Chloe walked briskly down our street, but instead of turning towards the main shopping area, she turned left, heading towards a more industrial part of town I rarely visited. The houses here were smaller, closer together, with faded paint and overgrown yards. I slowed my pace, my heart pounding, and ducked behind a parked delivery truck. Chloe didn't look back. She continued on, turning down an even narrower street where the sunlight struggled to reach. I hid behind a stack of old pallets outside a warehouse. I watched as Chloe stopped in front of a rundown apartment building, knocked on a specific door, and quickly slipped inside. I stood there, my breath catching in my throat, my head swimming. What was my daughter-in-law doing here? This wasn't a store or a friend's house. I wanted to march up to that door, knock on it, and demand answers, but my feet felt rooted to the spot. I was terrified of what I might find, terrified that the truth would shatter our family completely. In the end, I turned and walked back home, each step heavier than the last, my mind a whirlwind of questions. I had barely closed the front door behind me when I froze. Chloe was standing in the kitchen, wearing a simple pair of jeans and a t-shirt, a complete change from the blue dress she'd left in. She was wiping down the counter, and she looked up at me with an unreadable expression. "Where have you been, Mom? You were gone for a while." I stood there, speechless, my mouth dry. How was this possible? Just minutes ago, I had seen her disappear into that apartment building wearing a dress. How could she be here, changed and acting so normal? I just went for a long walk," I stammered. Chloe just nodded and went back to her cleaning, but her gaze lingered on me, and it sent a shiver down my spine. I went up to my room, pretending I needed to put something away, but really, I just needed to escape her gaze, to try and calm my racing heart. That night, I was sitting in my room, trying to read, when Noah ran in, his face tear-stained. He hugged my legs, his small body shaking with sobs. "Grandma!" Mommy yelled at me just because I spilled some water. Yesterday, she was so nice, she even let me help her bake a cake. I gathered Noah into my arms, stroking his hair, but inside I was a mess of anger and confusion. "Your mommy is just tired, sweetheart." "Don't be sad," I whispered, but my voice trembled. Noah buried his face in my shoulder. "Grandma, I want yesterday's mommy back." I held him tighter, fighting back my own tears. My grandson's words were like a dagger, twisting the wound of my suspicion ever deeper. I couldn't sleep that night. I lay in bed, staring at the shadows on the ceiling. The images replayed in my mind on a loop. Chloe in the blue dress, walking into that building, Chloe in jeans and a t-shirt in our kitchen, and Liam's voice, insistent and certain. "She's on my ship." I got out of bed, took out my journal, and wrote a single sentence, a thought so wild I barely dared to form it. Maybe they are not the same person. The words on the page seemed to mock me, and I started to tremble. The next morning, I knew what I had to do. I went back to that rundown street. I couldn't live with this uncertainty a moment longer. I took the family photo from the living room mantel, the one where Chloe is smiling so brightly next to David and Noah. I clutched it in my hand and left the house, my heart a mixture of determination and dread. The street was just as grim as it had been the day before. I stopped by a small corner store where a woman was arranging vegetables in a crate. I showed her the photo and asked, "Excuse me, have you seen this young woman around here?" The woman squinted at the photo and then nodded. "Oh yeah, sure. She lives in that building over there, apartment 2B, comes and goes at all hours." I thanked her, my heart pounding against my ribs, and walked towards the building she'd indicated. Apartment 2B was in front of me, its paint peeling, a single sad-looking plant on the windowsill. I stood there, my hands shaking, feeling as if the entire world had gone silent. I knocked on the door, and the sound echoed in the quiet hallway. The door opened, and I gasped. Standing before me was a woman who was the mirror image of Chloe, from her face to her hair to her build. But the resemblance ended there. This woman's eyes were filled with a deep-seated fear, and her hands, which clutched a worn dish towel, were trembling. I stammered, my voice breaking. "Chloe?" The young woman's eyes widened in panic, and she tried to slam the door shut. But just then, another voice came from inside the apartment, a voice that was gentle but firm. "Sophie, don't. It's time." I looked past the woman at the door and saw another young woman emerge from the shadows of the room. She was small and wore glasses, and her expression was one of weary kindness. She looked at me and offered a small, sad smile. "My name is Anna, Sophie's roommate, Mrs. Gable. Please, come in. I think it's time you knew the truth." I took a deep breath, my legs feeling like they might give out from under me, and stepped into the small, sparsely furnished apartment. The air was stale, and the only furniture was a lumpy sofa, a small table, and 2 chairs. In the corner, an elderly woman lay on a cot, a thin blanket pulled up to her chin, her breathing shallow. I felt a sense of claustrophobia, but I walked over and sat in the chair Anna offered me. The woman who looked just like Chloe, Sophie, lowered her head, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm so sorry. I'm not Chloe. My name is Sophie." I stared at her, my mind unable to process what I was seeing and hearing. Sophie. The name was unfamiliar, but the face was so painfully familiar. I clasped my hands together in my lap to stop them from shaking. "You need to explain to me why you look exactly like my daughter-in-law and why you've been in my house." Sophie looked up, her eyes filled with shame, but it was Anna who began to speak, her voice calm and steady. "Sophie is in a terrible situation, Mrs. Gable. Her mother is very sick, the woman on the cot over there. She needs expensive medication that Sophie can't afford." A few years ago, Sophie met Chloe by chance. They discovered they were identical twins, separated at birth. Chloe saw it as an opportunity. She offered to pay for their mother's medical bills, but in exchange, Sophie had to pretend to be her, to take her place in your home whenever Chloe needed her to. My head was spinning. Replace her? Why? Why would Chloe need someone to take her place? Sophie finally spoke, her voice trembling. "I don't know all the details, ma'am. She would just tell me, 'You need to be at the house for a few hours. Just go about the day, take care of the boy.' And then she would give me money, enough to buy my mother's medicine for the week. I was too scared and too desperate to ask questions. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with sobs. I looked at her, and my chest felt like it was being crushed. Every strange detail, every inconsistency from the past months suddenly clicked into place. The 2 different hands for writing, the Jekyll and Hyde personality, the moments of warmth followed by coldness. It all made a terrible kind of sense. It was like the final, horrifying piece of a puzzle had been slammed into place. Anna continued, her expression grim. "I don't know if this means anything, but one time, I saw Chloe meeting with a very rough-looking man. His name is Vincent. I overheard it when they were arguing in the hallway. He was demanding money. Sophie was waiting in the car, terrified. The name Vincent meant nothing to me, but it sent a chill down my spine. I remembered Liam's words. She's at a poker table next to a man who looks dangerous. The small apartment seemed to tilt. I tried to stay calm, but my trembling hand knocked over the glass of water Anna had placed on the table. She quickly cleaned it up, but I just shook my head, my voice choked with emotion. Chloe has been lying to my entire family." Sophie looked up, her face streaked with tears. "I'm so sorry, ma'am. I never wanted to hurt anyone. I just wanted to help my mother." I looked at this young woman, with Chloe's face, but with eyes full of a pain and regret I had never seen in my daughter-in-law. I wanted to be angry, to scream at her. But looking at Sophie, all I felt was a profound sense of pity. She wasn't the enemy. She was just another victim of Chloe's lies. My family, my home, everything I held dear was built on a foundation of deceit. I stood up, trying to steady my voice. "Sophie, do you know where Chloe goes? What she does when she makes you take her place?" Sophie shook her head, still weeping. "I don't know, ma'am. She just tells me to be there, and that she'll pay me. I never dared to ask for more." Anna placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Mrs. Gable, I know this is a terrible shock, but Sophie didn't have a choice." I looked around the small, bleak apartment at the sick woman on the cot. I understood Sophie's desperation, but it didn't lessen the sting of betrayal. I clenched my fists, fighting back my own tears. "I don't blame you, Sophie, but I need to know the truth. I have to protect my son and my grandson." I stood up, feeling as if the floor had dropped out from under me. "Thank you, Anna, for telling me what you know. I'll be back." I left the apartment, the bright afternoon sun feeling harsh and alien after the dimness inside. My heart was a cold, heavy stone in my chest. The next morning, I returned to that grim apartment building, the peeling paint and sad little plant now seared into my memory. The sun was shining, but I felt only a bone-deep chill, the cold wind of a storm that was about to break. I knocked on the door of 2B, clutching the family photo like a talisman, a reminder of what I was fighting for. This time, Sophie seemed less afraid. She opened the door with a shy but resigned look and invited me in. "Mrs. Gable, I was hoping you'd come back. Please, sit down." The apartment was the same, with its smell of disinfectant and the faint rattling cough from the corner. I sat in the hard wooden chair and looked at Sophie. She was wearing a faded but clean dress, her hair pulled back simply. She looked exhausted, but the raw fear was gone. I took a deep breath. "Sophie, I want to meet your mother. I need to understand this whole story." Sophie nodded and led me to the cot where the frail, white-haired woman lay, her eyes looking off into the distance. This was Mrs. Miller, Sophie's mother. I took her thin, cool hand in mine. "I'm Margaret Gable, David's mother, Chloe's husband." Mrs. Miller's gaze focused on me, her breathing labored. "Sophie is not my biological child," she said, her voice a reedy whisper. "She is a child I found, abandoned, on the steps of a church when she was just a baby." Her words hit me with the force of a physical blow. I froze, my heart hammering against my ribs, but I forced my voice to remain calm. "Please, tell me everything." The old woman coughed, a dry rattling sound, and then began her story. "So many years ago, I was a cleaner at a small clinic in a town not far from here. A young girl came in, no more than a teenager. She had given birth to twin girls. She was terrified and alone. She said she couldn't possibly care for 2 babies. Her family had thrown her out. She was going to leave one of them behind. My heart couldn't bear it. I couldn't let that tiny, innocent baby be abandoned. So I took her. That was my Sophie." She paused, her breath catching, and looked at Sophie with an expression of pure love. "I raised her as my own daughter, but I know she's always wondered about her real family. I have nothing to give her but my love." I sat there, clutching the side of the chair, my head spinning. "Do you know who Sophie's biological mother was?" I asked, my voice shaking. Mrs. Miller shook her head. "I only know she was a frightened young girl from out of town." I didn't ask questions. I just wanted to save the baby. I looked at Sophie, who stood with her head bowed, silent tears streaming down her face. "Mrs. Gable, I know nothing about my real parents," she whispered, her voice choked. "But when I met Chloe, I hoped she might know something. We look so much alike." But she never told me anything. I felt as if the air was being squeezed from my lungs. I asked Mrs. Miller if she had any old papers, anything from that time. She gestured towards a small, battered chest of drawers. Sophie retrieved a worn paper folder and handed it to me. Inside was a single document, a copy of a birth certificate that had been filed with the clinic, listing the date of birth for baby girl A and baby girl B. I scanned the paper, and my heart stopped cold. The date of birth was exactly the same as Chloe's, the date I had seen on her marriage license when she married David. I gripped the paper, my hands trembling, and looked at Sophie. You and Chloe? You're twin sisters," I said, my voice barely audible. Sophie broke down completely, covering her face with her hands. "Then Chloe is my sister. Why wouldn't she tell me? Why did she use me like this?" I looked at her, my own heart breaking. I thought of the day Chloe had first come to our home, so polished and confident, the perfect future wife. I had welcomed her, loved her, believed she would bring my son a lifetime of happiness. But now I knew. She had not only deceived our family, she had cruelly exploited her own long-lost sister, using her as a pawn to hide a secret life I couldn't yet fathom. I stood up and placed a hand on Sophie's shoulder. My voice was firm, but it couldn't hide my pain. "Sophie, from this day forward, I will not let anyone use you again. I will help you with your mother's medical care, but in return, I need your help. I have to bring this truth into the light, for David and for Noah." Sophie looked up, wiping her tears, and nodded. "I'll help you. I don't want to be a part of this lie anymore." I looked into her eyes and saw a quiet strength, and for the first time, I felt a glimmer of hope. I left the apartment and walked through the unfamiliar streets, my mind a battlefield. I passed by a park where children were laughing and playing. But in my head, Mrs. Miller's words echoed. 2 twins, one cherished, one abandoned. And now their fates had collided in the heart of my family. I returned home, my soul in turmoil, like a ship caught in a squall. The truth about Chloe and Sophie, the secret of the twins, was a weight that threatened to pull me under. I knew I had a choice to make: to confront my daughter-in-law, the woman who had woven a web of lies around us, or to let the truth destroy my family from within. That night, I called Liam. My voice was steady, though my heart felt like it might beat out of my chest. "Liam, I need you to come home tomorrow night. There are some things we need to discuss." Liam was immediately concerned. "Mom, is everything okay? Has something happened?" I kept my voice even. "Just come home, dear. I need you here. And if you can, bring a record of Chloe's activity on the ship's accounts." He didn't press for more details. He just said, "Of course, Mom. I'll be there." I hung up the phone and sat in the dark, feeling the weight of the coming confrontation. I knew that tomorrow night would change our family forever. The next day, I woke with a sense of grim purpose and began to prepare for a family dinner. I set the dining room table with our best china and a fresh tablecloth. I cooked David's favorite roast chicken and made the chocolate cake that Noah adored. I wanted this dinner to be a line in the sand, a moment that would mark the end of the lies. I was in the kitchen peeling potatoes, but my mind was far away, lost somewhere between the dark, narrow street and Sophie's tear-streaked face. I told myself to be strong, for David and Noah's sake, but every slice of the knife felt like it was cutting into my own heart. David came home at dusk, looking weary from his week. When he saw the elaborate table setting, he was surprised. "What's the special occasion, Mom?" I forced a smile, trying to appear calm. "I just felt like we should all have a proper family dinner." "Go on, sit down." Chloe came downstairs in a stylish dress, a polite smile on her face, but I could see a flicker of anxiety in her eyes. Noah ran to me and hugged my legs. "Grandma, the cake smells so yummy." I stroked his hair, a lump forming in my throat. I knew that after tonight, Noah's innocent world might never be the same. We all sat down at the table, and for a while, the conversation was normal. David talked about a difficult client at work. Noah chattered about a new friend at school. Chloe nodded and smiled at all the right moments, but I saw her hand tremble slightly as she lifted her wine glass. I took a deep breath and gave Liam the signal we had arranged. He was waiting outside. He walked in, and right behind him was Sophie, looking pale and nervous in a simple borrowed dress. Her face was an exact copy of Chloe's, but her eyes were filled with a quiet sorrow. Everyone at the table froze. Noah looked from Chloe to Sophie, his brow wrinkled in confusion. "Why are there two mommies?" he asked innocently. David went pale and dropped his fork with a clatter. Chloe leaped to her feet, her voice shrill. "What is the meaning of this, Mom?" I stood up, gripping the back of my chair to steady myself. "Sit down, Chloe," I said, my voice low but firm. "It's time for the truth." I began to tell the story, and every word felt like a betrayal of the life I thought we had. I talked about Liam's call, about seeing her on the cruise ship when she was supposed to be at home. I mentioned the changing hands, the shifting moods, and finally, my journey to the rundown apartment where I met Sophie and learned the secret of the twins. "You and Sophie are sisters," I said, looking Chloe directly in the eye. "You used your own sister to cover your tracks. Now, tell us the truth." Chloe was trembling, her face ashen. "She's lying. You're all lying to ruin my life. How could you?" But Liam stepped forward and placed a stack of papers on the table. "This is a printout from the ship's casino," he said, his voice hard as steel. "It shows your player's card being used for 3 days straight, racking up thousands of dollars in losses. You can't be at home and on a cruise ship at the same time." Chloe stared at the papers, her mouth opening and closing, but no words came out. Noah, who was sitting next to her, suddenly said, his voice small but clear, "It's true, Grandma. Some days my mommy is the best mommy in the world, and some days she's mean. I don't like the mean mommy." My grandson's words were a final, heartbreaking blow, and I had to fight back tears. The air in the room was thick with tension. I nodded to Anna, who had slipped in through the back door. She stood by the doorway, her gaze unflinching, and spoke to the room. "I saw Chloe with a man named Vincent. He's a loan shark. She has a gambling problem, and she forced Sophie to take her place so she could get away without anyone knowing." David turned to his wife, his voice choked with disbelief. Is this true, Chloe? Tell me it's not true. Chloe was silent for a long moment, and then her face twisted into a mask of fury. Yes, it's true, she screamed, her voice raw. I have a lover, and I have debts. I'm tired of this boring life. I'm tired of being a perfect wife in this perfect little house. Charles gives me excitement. And you, David, you're just predictable. Her words exploded in the quiet room. David looked as if he'd been struck, his hands clenched into white-knuckled fists. Noah burst into tears and ran to me, burying his face in my skirt. Grandma, what's wrong with Mommy? He sobbed. I wrapped my arms around him, my own tears finally falling. I looked at Chloe with a shattered heart. She stood there, defiant, without a trace of remorse. David stood up, his voice shaking. Chloe, how could you? She turned and walked towards the door without answering. Sophie, who had been standing silently by the wall, finally spoke, her voice quiet but strong. Sister, you didn't have to destroy them. I wanted to help you, but I never knew it was like this. Chloe shot her a look of pure venom but said nothing. She just walked out, slamming the door behind her, leaving a devastating silence in her wake. After that terrible night, a heavy quiet settled over my home. The living room, once filled with the sounds of Noah's laughter and the murmur of conversation, now felt vast and empty. I had spent my entire life trying to build a happy family, and now I was standing in the ruins of that dream, wondering how we could ever rebuild. Chloe left without a backward glance, leaving David hollowed out with grief and Noah confused and tearful. I knew our lives had been irrevocably altered. A week later, the divorce papers were filed. I didn't go with David to the courthouse, but he told me about it later, his voice devoid of emotion. Mom, she didn't even look at me. She just signed the papers and left with that man, Charles, as if Noah and I were strangers she'd passed on the street. I sat beside him, holding his hand, my own heart aching. Chloe hadn't asked for custody of Noah. It was as if our little boy had been nothing more than a role she had grown tired of playing. The pain of it was immense, not just for David, but for Noah, an innocent child caught in the wreckage of his mother's lies. Don't you worry, David, I said, my voice thick with unshed tears. We'll be all right. Noah will always be surrounded by love. But I knew the scars from this would be deep. David retreated into himself. He became quiet and distant, burying himself in his work or sitting for hours, just watching Noah play. I looked at my son and saw the same deep sadness I had seen in my husband Arthur's eyes in his final days. I wanted to tell him that everything would be all right, but I didn't know if it would. But into this darkness, Sophie came like a small, steady candle. She started visiting every day. She would bring over homemade soup, sit on the floor and build block towers with Noah, and gently answer his questions when he asked, Auntie Sophie, when is my other mommy coming home? I would watch Sophie, see Chloe's face, but with a heart that was entirely different. She was kind, patient, and had a natural warmth that drew Noah to her. One afternoon, I overheard Noah run to her, his voice full of excitement. Mommy Sophie, can you teach me how to draw a pirate ship? I froze, my heart clenching. He was calling her Mommy, a bright, happy smile on his face that I hadn't seen in weeks. Sophie laughed and ruffled his hair. Of course, my little pirate, but it has to be the grandest ship on the 7 seas. I stood in the doorway, my eyes filling with tears. Noah's innocent words were a balm to my own wounded spirit. I knew that Sophie wasn't just filling a space that Chloe had abandoned. She was creating her own place in our family with her genuine, loving heart. One evening, as I was washing the dishes, David called me into the living room. He was standing there, holding a small, simple ring in his trembling hands. His eyes were a mixture of hope and nervousness. Sophie stood beside him, her cheeks flushed. David got down on one knee, his voice cracking with emotion. Sophie, I don't want to waste another minute of my life. You brought the light back for me and for Noah. Would you do me the honor of being my wife and Noah's mom? Sophie burst into tears, looking at me as if for permission. I walked over, took her hand, and gave it a gentle squeeze. You are already part of this family, my dear. You deserve all the happiness in the world. She hugged me, her tears of joy soaking my shoulder. And in that moment, I knew our family was truly beginning to heal. David and Sophie's wedding was a small, simple affair in our own backyard, but it was filled with more love than I had ever seen. I watched the two of them exchange vows under the old oak tree, with Noah, looking dapper in a little suit, serving as his father's proud best man. Liam flew in for the occasion, standing by his brother's side, his smile as wide as the ocean he captained. I sat in the front row, tears streaming down my face, but they were tears of gratitude, not sorrow. I looked at Sophie, in her simple white dress, holding my son's hand, and I knew that after all the pain and deceit, my family had finally found its true heart. Life settled into a new, peaceful rhythm. Isadora embraced her new life, caring for David and Noah with a quiet, unwavering love. She filled our home with the smell of fresh baking, sang Noah to sleep with old lullabies, and sat with David in the evenings, listening to him talk about his day with a look of genuine adoration. Matthew no longer asked about his other mother. He simply curled up next to Isadora, calling her mom with a smile that could light up the darkest room. I looked at my new family and saw the wounds slowly, surely, closing. One evening, I was sitting on the porch, the gentle breeze rustling the leaves in the garden. I could hear Noah's laughter from inside, mingling with Sophie's sweet voice. I peeked through the window and saw David at his desk, and Sophie bringing him a cup of coffee, pausing to place a gentle kiss on his head. I smiled, a sense of profound peace settling over me. I thought about the long, painful journey we had traveled, from that first, confusing phone call to the dark apartment where the truth was finally revealed. The truth had been a brutal storm, but as my dear Arthur always used to say, it's the truth that will set you free, Margaret. And he was right. The truth had freed us, it had brought us Sophie, and it had given us a new, more honest, and much happier beginning. I hope you enjoyed our story today. Remember to come back tomorrow for another one. And don't forget to click that notification bell so you don't miss out. If you'd like to hear another story that will surely touch your heart, you can click on one of the 2 videos you see on your screen now. Thank you for being with me.